Let's talk about Ivan's return against Forest, because I think I didn't realise like how huge that moment would be, but the mainstream media, I didn't think they would latch onto it so much, but it was like the only narrative that week. It was weird to see Brentford in the spotlight that much, and obviously it was amplified by how many interviews he's done, and we'll touch on that as well. But just on his return, I just want to get your view on, obviously the goal against Forest was big, and you kind of expected him to kick on from there, but, and I don't know if I'm being harsh with this, I would say the only game that he played to a standard that I'd become accustomed to seeing from him was that Man United at home game. Bar Forest at home, I think Man United at home, and then his game against Belgium for England were two games that I saw the Ivan Toney of last year. I don't know if that's harsh. What do you think?
No, yeah, I agree. I think he will be feeling really disappointed with how the season's gone. And I think I tweeted it after the final game, but if these are his final 6 months at Brentford and his final act in a Brentford shirt is to hammer a free kick over the bar against Newcastle United, then it's a little bit of a sad ending to what's been a really good and beneficial relationship for both the club and for the player. That week leading up to the Nottingham Forest game was really fun. Like you said, Ivan Toney kind of did a few interviews with, I think he did one with Sky Sports and kind of spoke about what he'd experienced over the last year or so. I remember Stormzy and Dave were in the crowd that day. Steve Holland, England's assistant coach, was watching. So it was a really big moment. You had the Undertaker music. But then when, I've said this before, but when Forest scored and went 1-0 up, I thought, this is going to look silly. Live on Sky Sports made a big deal out of the Ivan Toney comeback show, only for that to happen. So when he scored a free kick and somehow did it in controversial fashion by moving the ball and upsetting the Forest hierarchy and the Forest fan base with the foam incident, Foamgate as some people called it, which I thought was ridiculous. That just kind of sums him up in a nutshell, right? He's never that far from being the headline act. But ever since then, he's had a few glimmers. I think he scored 4 in his first 5 games after he came back, and it felt like he was really going to kick on. But he's not scored since that win against Wolves in February, which is really disappointing. I agree. I thought he was really good against Belgium for England. I hope to see him on Friday night play against Iceland, because he didn't play against Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I hope he manages to get into the Euro squad. But I think based on his form over the last 6 months, he probably doesn't deserve to be in there. And it's a real shame, because he's a very good player. The hip injury clearly impacted his movement. I've said this before, but I've noticed that when Ivan misses a couple of games, it also takes him 2 or 3 games, I think, to find his sharpness. I think you can just see that he's a second or 2 off the ball. And maybe just not playing football for 8 months and all of the drama around that situation in the ban, maybe it did just impact him. Because I know in the media and in interviews, he comes across as very bullish and very headstrong and very confident. But actually, maybe he had that initial excitement and rush of getting back onto the pitch and trying to get into the England squad. And then maybe the injury kicked in, the excitement faded, Brentford weren't winning, and it just kind of crumbled away a little bit. But I've reported this many times. It feels inevitable he's going to leave this summer. Where he ends up going, I don't know. I think it's a shame that there were not that many highlights from his final 6 months at Brentford. But I'd like to think people will look back in the years to come and say, do you know what? He was probably one of the best players, definitely in Brentford's recent history, and maybe in Brentford's history overall, in terms of the importance of getting the club promoted and, scoring the goals to help keep them in the Premier League. So he's been really fun to watch over the last few years.
Yeah, I don't think anyone doubts how good he was. I remember saying to you on a pod, maybe that's first or second time we had you on, that we thought he was the best striker out in the league outside of Harry Kane and Erling Haaland. But I want to get your take on the interviews, because I think your take's valuable, because you're not a Brentford fan, and it was something that really irked me, because every time you meet someone new, you tell that if they're into football, what team do you support? I support Brentford. Every time I do that in that kind of time period, they'd be like, "Oh, your fucking striker hates you. Why you just support Brentford?" And it kind of made a mockery of us. It was almost like, why are Brentford fans accepting this? And because we're quite a small club, it was like our voices didn't really get out. It's not that we're accepting this. It's just it's difficult. It's difficult to combat. Obviously, big players have big ambitions, and he is a big player, and I don't have any sort of spitefulness towards him for wanting to go on to play for a big club, but it was just the way that he phrased it. And I think just, I don't know if it was, his agent trying to get him out in the media before the return, but it was almost, he was trying to push for that move away. And I don't think I heard him say in any of those interviews, I'm focused on coming back and scoring goals for Brentford, or I'm focused on keeping Brentford in the league, or something along those lines, something that would have gone a long way that feels quite small looking back, but he just didn't do. So like just on those interviews, could you see why some of the fan, and I think, to be honest, by the time sort of the last game of the season came around, I think most of the fan base kind of wanted to get rid of him. But just talk to me about the interviews.
Yeah, I can understand that sentiment. And firstly, I think he did say in a lot of those interviews, my main focus is just coming back and playing for Brentford and scoring goals for Brentford. And I think in one he might have said the main focus is just keeping this team in the league. So he did always say that. An element of it probably is, I'm so sick and tired of talking about my betting, that being asked about my future is something that just distracts people from talking about my betting. I want to move on from that period of my life. Talking about my future and what's going to happen is just a very easy way to kind of change the narrative. I think that will be an element of it. I think I personally don't have a problem with what he's saying. I think the issue was with the volume of interviews that he did. And that is just partially because of what had happened to him and how newsworthy he was at the time. Lots of people wanted to interview him and lots of people just wanted to ask that question. I also think, I remember interviewing David Raya, I think in January or February last year, and Raya said the same thing. And Raya had turned down a couple of contracts from the club, but Raya was maybe not as high profile as Toney was, so he didn't do as many interviews where he was being asked about it. But I'm sure if in that period of his life, Raya had been asked in 4 different interviews, what's your future? He probably would have said the exact same as Ivan Toney. So I think that needs a little bit of context to it. But of course, I completely understand the fan base feeling frustrated with him. But I also think he probably would have left last season if he hadn't been banned. His value was at its highest. He was performing really well. And so in a way, I think this whole situation just means that Brentford have managed to hold on to him for an extra 6 months. You've got an extra 20 games out of him. He's managed to kind of help you stay in the league at a point where things were looking a little bit shaky. So now it's just the perfect time to say, let's shake hands. Thanks, Ivan Toney. You've been amazing for us. It's time for us to move on. We can reinvest into the squad with a different player with the money we're going to get from your sale. You can go on and kind of achieve the ambitions you want to. But yeah, I think it was the volume and the amount of times he was getting interviewed about that particular topic, which was probably the most, which I understand why it irritated people so much.
I think the Diary of a CEO one was just bizarre. Like, if he was going to do an interview, the last person I thought he'd do an interview with or a podcast with would be the Diary of a CEO. It's just weird. But just before we move on, where does he end up for you?
I really don't know, because lots of teams, firstly, you've got to consider how much Brentford want for him. And he has a year left on his contract. He's 28 years old. He's an England international. Hopefully goes to the Euros. And is very good at taking penalties, offers something a little bit different in terms of he's more of a classic centre forward, which you don't really see that many of these days. So he's got a little bit of a unique skill set in that regard. But it's probably only a few teams in the world that can actually afford him. And some of those teams, I'm talking about Big Six Premier League teams, have financial fair play considerations to think about, and so might not be able to buy him. His age is probably a factor. Some clubs would probably want to invest that amount of money that we're talking about into a younger player. It's really hard. I've said this multiple times. I think it will drag on for a long time. I don't think there'll be a resolution in the next couple of weeks. I think we'll be looking at, the middle of August maybe until something gets resolved. Maybe I'm completely wrong. The Euros is probably going to impact it anyways, because if he goes, he's going to be wrapped up in that and won't have time to think about it. I really don't know. Obviously, there were a lot of links to Arsenal at the beginning of the year, but then Havertz has kind of come into his own in the second half of the season, and maybe they probably don't need Tony's skill set anymore. He's been linked to Chelsea, but Chelsea, under the Bowley Clearlake Consortium, have pretty much only signed players under the age of, I think it's 24. Really hard to see where he goes. Obviously, maybe, but they've still got Richarlison.
Yeah.
So would they want to spend, I don't know, 50, 60, 70, 80 million pounds on Ivan Toney as well? I don't know. It's so hard. And I think that's kind of the tricky situation Brentford find themselves in. If they had 6 or 7 clubs who all wanted to sign Ivan Toney, then you could probably say, okay, he's only got a year left on his contract, but there's 6 or 7 of you. You've got to pay us 100 million pounds. If there's less interest, then the price is going to drop. So that's why it's so hard to work out where he's going to go and how much he's going to cost. I've seen some reports in the last month or two saying that he's worth 40 million pounds, but I'd be really surprised if the club let him go for that much. I could be wrong, but I think they'd want a little bit more than that for a player who's been so important to them over the last couple of years. And it's also about, if you sell Ivan Toney for 40 million pounds, do people then think in the future that you sell players at a low price, basically? Are you seen as easy to negotiate? And I think the club would probably consider that message that it sends out as well, if you're letting your best player go below market rate.
Do you think it's probably like something that's going to happen after the Euro, Sam? You reckon?
I think so. I think, just like I said, because the interest is not immediately obvious in him, I think it will take a little bit of time to bubble. It's probably going to be one of those situations that will be part of a chain reaction. So player X is going to move to club Y, and then off the back of that, loads of different moves are going to happen. You know, a club is going to miss out on their main striking target, so maybe they pivot to Ivan Toney. Who knows? I mean, Victor Osimhen's constantly linked with moving to different clubs. Benjamin Sesko's constantly linked to different clubs. So if one of those or both of those players move, then maybe that means a different club is then going to pivot to Toney. I don't know. It's confusing. I wish I could give you guys more answers. I do. I'm not doing this on purpose. But I think what I can say is that whatever happens, yes, I now cover Spurs, but whatever happens, I'll stay across that and try and keep you guys updated. But for now, I just have a feeling it's going to rumble on.
Good stuff, mate. Good stuff. Just before we move on, I do want to. I think I said earlier that the only 2 games that I've seen him play well against United and Belgium for England. There was a game against Arsenal where I thought he was quite good. In the the one where Wissa blocks Ramsdale, and the one that's the thing that sticks out to me. And I remember doing a Burnley podcast at the time, doing like an opposition preview. The thing that stuck out to me in that game was Tony's effort from like the halfway line on the half volley with his weak foot, and I was like, if you like that. For me, that summarizes that effort, just summarizes his kind of overall game. That the audacity that he had to take that ball on his weaker foot on the half volley and almost score was just insane. It was just an incredible effort, and that's the kind of caliber of player that I've become accustomed to seeing. And it's just a shame that his season kind of petered out following the 4 and 5 that he got right at the start of the return. I do have a question about playing styles of Ivan, but I thought I could kind of merge it into the next one in regards to, and I don't want to kind of label this section as maybe a criticism of Thomas Frank, but there were groans during the season, probably typified by the 2-1 loss away at Burnley. Groans from the fan base, including about the 5 at the back system, playing against teams outside of the top 6. And especially because I think it was a time when we've made our criticisms of Zanka as well, but he deployed Vitali at left back. Sergio had come in before. We'd had Aya coming back. There were options. There was definitely a season where we had the same sort of nature of injuries, and he experimented with a 4, but he was kind of sticking to that 5 at the back system. And also, when Ivan came back as well, I was surprised to see that the playing style we didn't see a kind of reversion to what we'd seen the previous season. When Ivan came back, we kind of used him as that target man. You'd have thought that with Flecken's distribution being at probably the level that David Reyes was, that we'd see that kind of pump it up to Ivan. We've got the willing runners, and then we'll kind of go from there. We'll win the second balls, but we didn't really see that. So I don't know. I don't really know what my question is, to be honest. Like,
I think I know what you're saying. And firstly, I remember joking to my colleague Andy Jones, who covers Burnley, that I'm never going back to Turf Moor, because in 2 visits, it was the free one in October 2021. And I remember that day, Pontus Jansson passed the ball to the advertising hoardings. And I thought, yep, that sums the day up. And then obviously Reguilon was sent off. Officially, it went down as like the 10th minute, but the VAR check must have taken 5 minutes. It went on for ages.
Don't know why.
And you're just thinking, great. And it was also the day where Vincent Kompany dropped James Trafford for the first time. And that was a really big thing for the Burnley fan base. And they really got behind Muric, and they kept mooing every time he hit the ball. So it was a very, very funny game. I understand, and I remember people I remember, reading people's comments about Frank kind of rigidly sticking to the 3-5-2, and I think I even wrote a piece saying that he kind of just needs to be brave enough and go back to the 4-3-3. It was really difficult that time of the season because I understood why he stuck with the 3-5-2, because it offers just a little bit more security and safety. The wide options still weren't really quite there, and Mbeumo wasn't fully fit just yet. If you play KLP, Visser, and Toney, then Visser or KLP have got to play out a position on the right, and it just doesn't seem as fluid or as natural. So I understood all of that, but you just also want a little bit of confidence against teams lower down in the table and want to be able to beat them at their own game. And I agree that the first 2 seasons in the Premier League, that David Raya long ball up to Ivan Toney. Toney flicks it on for Visser and Mbeumo. That was like cash money. It was just guaranteed goals. It was just bizarre how often that works. And we didn't really see too much of that. And I don't know, that was a point in the season where you just felt like something needed to change. Just anything needed to change just to offer something a little bit different. But I think Thomas Frank knew, because the Luton Town and the Sheffield United games were coming up, that Brentford always kind of had their fate in their own destiny. So he never really truly needed to hit the panic button. Although it felt like the panic button was very close at one point, never really actually needed to hit it. But his argument would always be that the personnel just wasn't quite there to play 4-3-3 yet. And it wasn't until Mbeumo was fully fit again that he could do that.
Yeah, I think the low points in that spell, obviously the Burnley loss we've just touched on, the West Ham one, probably the earliest I think I left a game this season. To be fair though, sandwiched in there was 2 good performances against City. Arsenal away was a good performance, but it was that point in the season where we had Spurs, Liverpool, City twice, Arsenal, West Ham away, all within the space of like a month and a half, I think. And then combine that with Ethan's injury at Wolves, which I was there, right? And I saw Ethan get injured, and we decided to stick him up top for like 10 minutes towards the end of the game. And I don't know if that contributed to the length of his injury, but we from the stands, we were just like, get him off. He's not affecting the game. We're 2-0 up. We'll just get him off the pitch. It's just going to prolong his injury. But I think that was the point in the season where we were all thinking, shit, like this could be really bad, especially sort of that Burnley game. I think we were all thinking there is now so much riding on the Sheffield United and the Luton games that if we don't pick up points from there, if we don't get 4 points minimum, we really are looking over our shoulder now.
Well, it was Pinnock and me, right? So I think Pinnock got injured first and then Ben Mee in that West Ham game. And I think the West Ham game is the game Sergio Reguilon, in an interview with the Telegraph or the Times, I can't remember which one it was, told Thomas Frank afterwards it was one of the top 3 worst games of his career or something like that. Mohamed Kudus tormented him all over the place. I'm just kind of looking back over some of the games in particular to see if anything stuck out. The one with Manchester United, I wasn't at. It was my best friend's wedding, so apologies, people. But I remember just seeing the updates and seeing Twitter. I was on the dance floor, just constantly looking, and people were saying Brentford are battering Man United, Brentford are battering Man United. And then they went 1-0 up. And I think, again, that game kind of sums up Brentford's season in a nutshell. Yeah. Played so well, didn't get what they deserved from it. I think the Aston Villa game was one of those moments where it looked like it could have got ugly. And then if Brentford had won that game, I think the confidence boost that would have given everybody, even taking a point from that game was big. But I think winning that, there's been other moments in the last couple of seasons where Brentford have probably won games where they didn't deserve to. And I remember in that 12-game unbeaten run, I think Janelt scored a really late equaliser against Crystal Palace. And then I remember in the beginning of that season, Visser scored a really late equaliser against Crystal Palace. There were just all these moments where Brentford should have lost a game or should have drawn a game, and something happened and they managed to get away with all 3 points. And it felt like the complete reverse of that happened this season, where every time it felt like, there was magical 3 points within grasp, something silly would happen. I can't remember how many times Brentford hit the post against Manchester United. What was it? 4 times. Had, I think, 84 touches in the box, which is now the second highest number in the Premier League in the last 3 or 4 seasons, I think. They're ridiculous numbers and ridiculous stats, but for whatever reason, the ball would just not go into the net. And so that's when collectively you feel like, wow, we're just in a really difficult position here. Is the luck ever going to
Mhm.
turn? And I remember writing about it, but I think it was after the 2-2 draw with Chelsea, so maybe before the Burnley game, but it's definitely in March. Thomas Frank was quite defensive in a press conference. I've never really seen him be like that before in my 3 years at the club. You know, he was asked about an injury to a player. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Ben Mee, because Ben Mee had been ruled out for the season. And he was asked how that kind of sums up your season, doesn't it? And Thomas Frank went, yes, but I'm going to continue fighting. And it kind of felt like this is a little bit of a rallying cry here. And if he's giving a bit of a rallying cry, then clearly he's feeling the pressure a little bit. So yeah, that was the point in the season where it really felt like Luton were beginning to string a couple of results together. I can't remember when it was, but I remember Luton were losing against Bournemouth, and then I think they came from behind and won that game, and maybe moved to within 3 points of Brentford. And I think that was when it was, okay, this really is getting tense and tight now. So yeah, that part of the season was definitely the most, I think, stressful and unenjoyable for everybody involved.
I think following the United game, which, by the way, that was maybe the most I've seen us dominate a team in the Premier League. It was insane watching that game. If there was ever like, and I know it might be biased because I'm a Brent fan, but if there was ever a game to kind of explicate how poor Man United have been at some points this season, it was that one. Coming up against a Brentford team who, like I just said, come off a run with 7 points from a possible 51, and the shots, the fact that we almost lost that game, that would have been a crime. But anyway, we'll come back. It was like we had Villa, Chelsea, and Brighton before we had Sheffield United and Luton. And I remember it's funny that you mentioned Frank getting prickly, because I remember there was the Chelsea game at home, and I wasn't at that game, but apparently there were boos at half time when we were 1-0 down. And I remember Frank coming out in his post-match saying, "What the fuck? Like, this is uncalled for." And I completely agree with him. Like, I went out on Twitter and defended him in his comments, because I just think booing when you 1-0 down against Chelsea is just a bit strange. Like, there would have been other points this season where we could have booed, like the West Ham game when we were 2-0 down after 5 minutes. But credit to the team. 3 points from those 3 games. It's like the fight back against Villa was a highlight for me, and it was a bit sour because we didn't manage to hang on to the 3 points. But to be 2-0 down against Europe chasing Villa, and then to bring it back, and then to complete the turnaround, that was a big moment for me. That was probably my highlight of the season, when Worcester gets that third. But those huge games against Sheffield United and Luton, it felt the Luton win especially, that was like vindication. It was almost like Brentford at their best, what we could have been this season with an almost fully fit team. And that coincided with the emergence of Mikkel Damsgaard, who's probably had his best run in the team so far, I would say, since he signed for Brentford, and also Sergio Reguilon coming into his own. Talk to me a little bit about that Luton game in particular, just because I think it was the moment, one of the moments of the season, and also Damsgaard and Reguilon as well.
Yeah, I think what you just said was the piece I wrote after the Luton game. Like, this is what Brentford season could have been. Mm-hmm. Keane Lewis-Potter scored, Schade scored, Visser scored, and I don't think Mbeumo scored, but I think he got 2 or 3 assists.
Yeah.
And it was those kind of front four, the future of Brentford when Toney leaves, all combining together to devastate an effect. And the press box in Luton is interspersed with the fans. So I've literally got Luton season ticket holders right behind my ear. And I remember just before Visser scored, the Luton fans going, "Oh, fuck." And then he curls it into the top corner. But it was just a great day. And I could also see to my right-hand side, the director's box. I can see Brentford's chairman, Cliff Crown. I can see director of football, Phil Giles. I can see loads of senior figures at the club jumping up on their feet and smiling, because I think they knew how big a result that was. You saw the scenes in the away end. It also felt like quite a big moment for KLP, because he did that, quite a cool little celebration, kind of cupping his ear to the fans. It just felt like a great day. It felt like everybody was unified. I'm pretty certain the sun was shining as well. It's one of those days where you think, one of those days where it gives you false hope. You think, yeah, next season is going to be our season. It kind of like tricks you, lures you into a false sense of security. But I mean, I've had my concerns about Damsgaard over the last couple of years, but I think the final 2 or 3 months, I thought he was excellent. Yes, we know he's not the most physical person in the world, but clearly now that he's fully over his injury issues, he looks like the technical wizard, for want of a better word, that everybody thought that Brentford were getting 2 years ago. And I feel so bad for him that goal against, I think it was Sheffield United, got disallowed because Collins fouled McBurney. but Damsgaard was just starting to have a much bigger impact at the top of the pitch. You know, he goes on that little bit of a mazy dribble, I think, in the build-up to a goal in the Sheffield United game, the own goal anyways. So he had a massive contribution. I think Sergio Reguilon, after the red card, after the bad performance against West Ham United, was much more solid. And I think he kind of restored his reputation a little bit and seems to have really enjoyed his kind of spell with Brentford. So everything just kind of came together in those two games against Sheffield United and Luton Town, and the pressure was off. Everybody felt relieved, and it was time to just kind of enjoy the final couple of games of the season.
So some people about Reguilon were saying that we've signed on loan the worst left back in the league after those first two games against Burnley and West Ham. But we've said that if you combine Reguilon going forward and Rico Henry defensively, I think you've got the perfect left back there. I think
you have, and I think Reguilon is used to playing in teams, Man United, Tottenham, who probably have more of the ball than Brentford, and so he probably can push forward a little bit more. And I think he probably just had to tweak the way he plays a little bit. But certainly, his contributions going forward, some of the crosses he was putting into the box, and his set-piece delivery was incredible and had a massive impact. He didn't always cover himself in glory and, you know, made a mistake against Newcastle United on the final day of the season. But he did the job that he was brought in to do. He solved the problem at left-back, provided going forward. Brentford end the season happy. Reguilon ends the season happy. And I think the key thing is that Brentford won't sign him permanently because his wages are just too high. Because you could have a situation where you think, do you know what? Reguilon's done really well for us. He's helped us stay up. Maybe we should just sign him and reward him anyways. But I just think for the wages that he's on, the right decision is to say thanks, but no thanks, move on and leave it at that.
Yeah, I think so. There were groans, not groans from the fans, but there were some fans saying, you know, we should try and keep him and see if that we can finally get the left back that we need. But I think having Henry and Reguilon at the club would have just been a way to piss one of them off when it would have done. So let's. I want to touch on. Well, I think to be fair, I think that would be a good place to wrap this first section because we're obviously going to get the big win against Bournemouth. That was a great day out, and then we don't really need to speak about Newcastle. Let's move on to some questions from the listeners. Obviously, there's a few in here that we probably would have already answered. So I'm just going to pick out the ones that we haven't answered yet. Rob on Twitter is asking, what are the most likely tactical changes we will see given the changes we expect in the Bees lineup?
The biggest one is Igor Thiago, really, who got injured by Antonio Nusa. Actually, if there's any moment that sums up Brentford's season, it's that. Your club record signing getting injured by someone who could have been your club record signing. It's quite something. I think, next season it will be all about Igor Thiago. You know, invested loads of money into him. I think it's 36.5 million euros, including add-ons. And considering Nathan Collins was the club record signing at 23 million, it's quite a hefty jump. So I think next season it will be about that, you know, a return to the 4-3-3 on a permanent basis, trying to be more ball dominant. Thiago playing through the middle and Mbeumo out right, Visser, Schade, KLP kind of coming off the bench or kind of rotating on that left wing role. And I think what we probably need to see is a little bit of refreshment in central midfield. You've had Jensen, Norgard and Jan out in there for 4 or 5 years together. I think Jensen and Norgard arrived in 2019, Jan out in 2020. And no one's ever really challenged them long term. Obviously, Damsgaard is kind of finally starting to break through. Yehor Yarmouk had a really good season and hopefully will continue to get more minutes. But I still feel like another option is probably needed in there. De Silva's recovering from his ACL injury. Godos has left. Shannon Baptiste has left. Onyeka's one of those players who I don't think has ever fully captured the fan base, or his performances on the pitch have been very hit and miss. And so I feel like that's probably one area where, you know, a really good quality option in there would help out the club massively. I think
Emre Cognac.
I've not seen enough of him, and he's still only. Has he just turned 18?
Yeah, he's very young. I think 18, 19.
So I think it's a big leap to ask players at that age to perform at a high level. If they can, that's amazing. But I wouldn't rely on it. I'd expect Cognac is probably going to have a similar season to what Yehor Yarmouk's had, where he gets minutes off the bench here and there. I think what Thomas Frank really values is De Silva's ability to carry the ball. I think he's very unique in the squad in that regard. And so you need somebody who can do that. And if you look at some of their players who've been on loan, Marspert Harris is probably quite similar stylistically. It's just helped Portsmouth go up to the Championship from League One. And I do think that's a decision that the club need to make. There's a lot of players who are too good for the B team, but haven't quite broken into the first team squad yet. Marspert Harris, Paris Magoma, Finn Stevens, Daniel Oyugok, Matthew Cox. And I think a decision needs to be made on whether you keep some of those guys and actually trust them to have an impact on the first team, or whether maybe it's time to let them go, because some of those boys have been at the club. Some of those players have been at the club for 3-4 years now. So you feel like if they've not broken through yet, is it ever going to happen? So I'd say keep an eye out on those things.
Paris Magoma is definitely one that I hope to see after being Bolton's player of the season and almost helping them to promotion. We've got Richard on Twitter asking, and this is a good question. Hopefully it isn't anytime soon, but if Thomas Frank were to leave, would the club look for an external replacement, or is there an internal succession plan? And I have heard a few people on Twitter saying Justin Cochrane, who was in charge of the academy at Man United, right? Before coming to Brentford.
Yeah, he was in charge of the academy, and then I think he was in charge of England's under-15s, under-16s, under-17s. So he was at the FA for, I think, quite a long time. I think he started his career with Tottenham Hotspur's academy, or certainly that was towards the beginning of his career. Then was with the FA, then was with Manchester United's academy, I think, for a year before joining Brentford.
Yeah. So do you think that we recruit externally if Thomas Frank were to leave, or do you think there might be someone in the pipeline and within the club already?
I think Justin Cochrane is probably one to keep an eye on, just because obviously really, really highly rated internally and externally. He's got experience, obviously, at Tottenham, Manchester United, working with the FA. He's clearly a really high quality guy. I don't think the club keeps like a running list of targets for replacements for Thomas Frank. You always hear Brighton have got this list of managers that they constantly update with people that they keep an eye on. But certainly from the conversations that I had, Brentford don't really work that way. One, because Thomas Frank's been there for 5.5 years, which is remarkable longevity. I think after Guardiola, he's the longest serving manager in the Premier League now that Klopp's left. And also things just change so quickly. Kieran McKenna was somebody who was being talked about really positively. 1 minute he's being linked to Brighton, the next minute he's being linked to Chelsea and Manchester United. Things change so quickly when it comes to managers. Their reputation goes up and down like that. Nathan Jones was in charge of Southampton in the Premier League, a year and a half ago? And I think now he's with Charlton in League One. So I think if and when Thomas Frank leaves, Brentford will just make a decision on who is available in that moment. But I'm sure that they'd get a lot of quite interesting candidates, because they're a club that is going to give a manager opportunity. They're not going to make any knee-jerk decisions and sack them after 10 games. And obviously there's a very clear vision with what the club's trying to achieve in terms of buying young players, developing them. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest in the role. But for now, I don't think they really keep a list of head coaches that they're keeping an eye on.
There's a few more questions, but I think we've kind of summarized them in the first section. So sorry if we haven't answered your question, but hopefully it would have already been answered. I've just had a quick skim through and I think we have. So there's a couple of post-season thoughts that I want to tackle. First, I think that will be on the minds of everyone. Bryan Mbeumo's future. He's obviously been doing an interview, been speaking to Tony before he's done it. But what do you think his future is like? What's his level? Is he going to stay at Brentford for another season?
Sorry, ask me again, because I was looking through the questions from listeners and someone said, ask him if there's no loyalty in football these days. So I don't know if it's a subliminal shot at me for covering Spurs, but it made me laugh. So what was
on Bryan Mbeumo's future? No, it links to the question perfectly.
Oh, of course.
Bryan Mbeumo's future. What's his level? He did an interview recently with L'Équipe or another French outlet, and he said that he wants to play at the highest level. I don't think it will be this window, although I did see another article this morning that was linking him with the Liverpool move and that Liverpool could offer a player in return. I don't know how much truth there is in those reports. But yeah, Bryan Mbeumo's future.
I heard those comments and I thought it's happening again. First it's David Raya, then it's Ivan Toney, now it's Bryan Mbeumo. look, unfortunately, that's just kind of how it works. You know, Brentford are very comfortable with their position in the footballing hierarchy, for want of a better word. They are, you know, a mid-table club in the Premier League, and their best players are going to get poached by clubs who can offer much bigger wages, who can offer Champions League football, all those types of things, who can compete for trophies. And Mbeumo, I think Brentford are lucky in a sense that he got injured in the middle of the season, because I think if he'd continued
at the rate,
to maintain the performances that he had before the injury, then he probably would have got 20 plus goal involvements. And then loads more people are talking about him. But I think that injury just means that the chatter about him's quietened down a little bit. I really can't imagine the club letting Ivan Toney and Bryan Mbeumo go in the same window. I just think it's too risky. I don't think that's a situation they'd want to get themselves in. And Mbeumo's got 2 years left on his deal. And I think also the club have an option for an extra year. So really, he's got 3 basically, which means that they're in a really, really strong negotiating position. So I think they could probably turn around. I don't know if this has happened, but I'm sure they would at some point, if Mbeumo pushed for a move, turn around to him and say, well, Ivan Toney's leaving, we're not letting you leave. That's the end of it. But, you know, Mbeumo's really enjoyed his time at Brentford. He's become the main man this season, or he certainly was for the first part of the season, and I'm sure that would continue into next season. So maybe they might say to him, you stay here for 1 more year, leading the line, helping us transition when Ivan Toney leaves, and then you'll move to an even bigger club. But I certainly think his level is Big Six, because he's really improved his consistency. He's great off the ball, which will be a consideration for any of the top teams. He's got a fantastic attitude. He's good at penalties. He's good at set pieces, and just he continues to sharpen up that finishing in front of goal. Then loads of clubs will want him. And also, he's not 25 until September, so he's still a very, very, very young player performing at a very high level in the Premier League. So unfortunately, at some point he'll probably go, but I don't think it will happen this summer.
Just a couple of questions thrown forward to next season. We've got a couple come in from listeners as well, saying like, what areas do we need to strengthen in this window? Obviously, we've got Igor Thiago coming in. Links to Joby Bellingham that I think the Athletic reported on. There were links to, I don't want to butcher his name, Gilherme from Palmeiras that we were linked to, and I think his deal with West Ham kind of fell apart. That gave me vibes of, you know, Brentford players, or Brentford's links to players in the past who we've been linked to, and then they end up going to a different club, like someone like Mudryk or Brennan Johnson. But yeah, where do we need to strengthen this window, and who would you like to see more from in the current squad?
I've touched on it a little bit, but I think midfield is an area that needs to be looked at. I think there's enough strength and depth up front when everybody's fit, so I'm not too worried about that. But it wouldn't surprise me if the club do something slightly unexpected, like pursue the next Mudryk or the next Johan Bakayoko, for want of a better way of terming that. I think just a little bit more strength at fullback. It's clearly been a massive issue throughout the season. From what I understand, I know it was being reported last week, and I think it is true that Alfie Doughty is one of the options that the club are looking at from Luton Town. And that kind of makes sense. He's quite similar, I think, to Rico Henry in terms of, you know, likes to get forward and put some deliveries into the box. And I think he had 7 or 8 assists for Luton last season. So you can see the attraction, but who knows if that will actually happen. So yeah, fullback for definite. I think CDM, if we're talking very specifically, is something they need to work out a succession plan for, because Norgard turned 30 in March. He's not going to be around forever. Does that mean Janelt finally moves to CDM and you buy someone to kind of replace Janelt as a left centre mid? If we're getting really technical, then maybe. But yeah, I think the biggest things for me is getting an extra body in midfield, and yeah, getting some strength in fullback, and maybe centre back as well, if you consider that Zanka and me are not getting any younger, and they've both had, well, maybe not Zanka, but Me's had his issues with injuries this season, and so some of the other defenders. So I think Collins is now the only centre back. Oh, Collins and I are the only 2 centre backs in their 20s. Pinnock, me, and Zanka are all a little bit older.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with you in the midfield. I think we do need a bit more creativity in there. Or maybe just someone that's more of like a box-to-box, out-and-out 8. I think Janelt has displayed that at times, but there's even been some sections of the fan base saying they'd rather have Janelt as a 6 than Norgard. And I do understand those arguments, but I think Janelt is definitely a good player to have in the squad because he can cover so many positions. And I think, you've seen that this season with how many minutes he's played. But Jay, I'm really conscious we've been going on for an hour and a half. I got 3 questions for you specifically. Favorite memory covering Brentford?
There's 2. The 2-0 against Arsenal. I just knew that I was really going to enjoy covering the club, but I don't think I quite appreciated how special it was going to be until, the clap for Robert Rowan in the 28th minute, the scenes at the end, Thomas Frank hugging Woody. Just felt like I've been really fortunate here to start covering the club at a really special time in their history. And then the 4-0 win over Man United, second game of that season. The sun was blazing. Ten Hag was in his blazer with his hands on his hips. Ronaldo looked incredibly angry, and you just thought life is. You come away from the game thinking life is good. I can't have any complaints. 4-0. Absolutely blew them away, and it was my cousin's a big Man United fan, and I wound him up about it as well. So no, it was a good day all round.
Favorite player at Brentford in your time?
Oh, that's a tricky one. Tony's obviously given loads of highlights, but I do like Yano a lot as well. So maybe probably Yano.
Yano as your favorite player?
I think so. I just really like how versatile he is. I think he's very slick on the ball. I think he's very underrated. And I really like his story. He cost, 500,000 from VfL Bochum and has become the first player in Brentford's history to make 100 Premier League appearances. I think that's a hell of a story. And I don't think you're ever going to get less than a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10 from him. So I think I've always enjoyed watching him.
My last one, a bit of a rogue one. Best player you've seen live play against Brentford. Someone asked me this the other day, and I really didn't know who to say. I ended up saying, and it was really strange, I ended up saying Andy Robertson when he played for Hull, and we were in the Championship. Because I remember when we played against Hull, I remember thinking, Jesus Christ, he's really good when he was at Hull in Championship. But best player you've seen play against Brentford live?
Probably Alan Saint-Maximin, just because he is so hard to defend against. He's incredibly quick. His dribbling skills, etc., just you have no idea what he's going to do next. And I can remember him just causing Mazursov loads of problems. Although I actually think Mazursov, when he's come up against him, has done a pretty good job. You could have the game of your life against Saint-Maximin, and he's still probably going to get past you 5 times. So he's very, very entertaining to watch. So probably just say, in terms of just like how much I get excited by watching a player, then potentially him. Jay,
I just want to say on behalf of all Brentford fans, it's been a pleasure. Well, it's been great to have you cover the club. Thanks so much for all your articles and stuff. We wish you all the best at your new role at Spurs, mate. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
No, I really appreciate that. I've loved the last 3 years. It's been way better than I knew it was going to be fun, like I said, but it's been way better than I thought it would be. Like I said, I'm still going to be around, really enjoy interacting with the fan base. I've really loved it. So I'll still keep an eye on the club. Like I said, my gran is one of you now, so I have to keep following away. But I really appreciate all the messages and all the support people have given me over the years. I think from minute one, the fan base really took to me, and I really appreciate that. I feel like I'm a player saying goodbye. But no, thank you very much, guys. And obviously, again, Mike, thanks for having me on the Eden Road podcast quite a few times. And no, I've really enjoyed it. So I'm glad I've kind of got to do this and kind of sum up the last 3 years and the season in a really fun way.
Good stuff, mate. The Eden Road podcast will be back next week for a live end of season quiz. So do keep your eyes peeled for that across our socials. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So please do come and join us. It will be next week at some point. But as I said, keep your eyes peeled across our socials. It's at the Elam Road on Twitter and at Elam Road Pod on Instagram for updates on when that will be. And in the meantime, remember to drop a comment down below and subscribe to the YouTube and Spotify channels. Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Have a good off season.
All the best, guys.